Anxiety is most powerful when it convinces you that a thought is the same thing as reality. One thought appears, and suddenly the body responds as if the future has already happened. The heart becomes faster, the chest becomes tighter, the mind begins searching for evidence, replaying old memories, predicting conversations, imagining failure, rejection, danger, or loss. And the strange thing is that nothing may have changed in the room around you. You may still be sitting in the same place, breathing the same air, living the same moment. But inside, the mind has already traveled somewhere else. This is what makes anxiety so exhausting. It does not only make you afraid of what is happening, it makes you afraid of what might happen, what could happen, what once happened, what someone might think, what you might lose, what you might not be able to control. The anxious mind turns possibility into pressure. It turns uncertainty into a threat. It turns imagination into something the body experiences as real. But anxiety is not proof that you are weak. It is not a sign that your mind is broken. In many ways, anxiety is a protective system that has become too sensitive. It is trying to warn you, prepare you, and keep you safe. The problem is that it often reacts before wisdom arrives. It sounds the alarm before the facts are clear. It treats discomfort as danger and uncertainty as disaster. This is where Stoic psychology becomes useful. Not because it tells you to ignore your feelings, and not because it asks you to become emotionless. The Stoics were not trying to escape life. They were trying to see life clearly. They understood that suffering often grows in the space between what happens and what the mind adds to it. An event occurs, and then judgment arrives. A sensation appears, and then fear gives it meaning. A future remains unknown, and then the mind fills the unknown with threat. To quiet an anxious mind, we do not begin by attacking anxiety. We begin by understanding it. We calm the body before arguing with the mind. We return to the present before the imagination builds a disaster. We stop treating every anxious thought as truth. We learn to care without clinging, to act without needing total control, and to build a sense of inner safety that does not depend on life becoming perfectly predictable. The goal is not to never feel anxiety again. That would not be human. The goal is to stop letting anxiety become the voice that decides what reality means. And once that begins to happen, even slowly, the mind starts to remember something it had forgotten. Calm is not always the absence of fear. Sometimes calm is the ability to stay with yourself while fear is speaking. Understand anxiety as a signal, not an enemy. Anxiety becomes heavier when you start treating it as proof that something is wrong with you. The feeling arrives, the body tightens, the thoughts become louder, and almost immediately the mind adds a second layer of suffering. Why am I like this? Why can't I calm down? Why does my mind always go there? And in that moment, anxiety is no longer only an alarm. It becomes a personal accusation. The mind is not just afraid of the situation anymore, it is afraid of itself. A calmer way to begin is to see anxiety as a signal. Not a perfect signal, not always an accurate one, but still a signal. It is the mind and body trying to protect you from something they believe could be dangerous. Sometimes that danger is real and deserves attention. Other times it is imagined, exaggerated, or pulled from old experiences that no longer fully belong to the present. But anxiety usually begins with a protective intention. Somewhere inside, the nervous system is saying, "Pay attention, something might go wrong." This is why fighting anxiety too aggressively can make it stronger. When you treat anxiety like an enemy, The body receives even more evidence that something is unsafe. You become tense about being tense, afraid of feeling afraid, frustrated that the feeling has not disappeared quickly enough. And the more pressure you place on the mind to calm down immediately, the more the mind may interpret that pressure as another threat. Anxiety feeds on urgency. It grows when every feeling becomes an emergency. The Stoic approach is different. It does not begin with panic about the panic. It begins with observation. Epictetus often returned to the idea that we are not disturbed only by events themselves, but by the judgments we attach to them. Anxiety is full of judgments. This sensation means danger. This uncertainty means disaster. This mistake means failure. This silence means rejection. This future possibility means I will not be able to cope. The anxious mind often speaks in conclusions before the evidence is complete. To understand anxiety as a signal is to create a small space between the feeling and the story. You might notice the racing heart and say, this is activation, not necessarily danger. You might notice the fearful thought and say, this is a prediction, not a fact. You might notice the urge to escape and recognize that something in you is asking for safety, but you do not have to obey the first command that fear gives you. This does not remove anxiety instantly, but it changes your relationship to it. And that change matters. A signal can be listened to without being worshipped. Anxiety may be pointing toward a real need: rest, preparation, boundaries, clarity, support, or a conversation you have delayed for too long. Or it may simply be the old alarm system reacting to uncertainty, because uncertainty has always felt unsafe. Either way, the work is not to hate the signal. The work is to understand what it is trying to protect, and then respond with more wisdom than fear can offer on its own. And if this perspective gives you even a little more space inside yourself, stay with this episode, because next we will look at the hidden roots beneath the anxious mind. If this resonates with you, write calm in the comments as a small reminder that anxiety can be understood before it is obeyed. And if you find this episode useful, leave a like so this message can reach someone else who may need it today. Find the hidden roots behind your mental unrest. Anxiety often appears on the surface as a single thought. What if this goes wrong? What if I fail? What if they judge me? What if I lose control? But the thought is usually not the full problem. It is often the visible part of something deeper. Like smoke coming from a hidden fire, anxiety points toward places in the inner life where something has been strained, ignored, pressured, or left unresolved for too long. One of the most common roots of anxiety is perfectionism. Not the healthy wish to do things well, but the belief that mistakes are unsafe. When the mind believes it must be perfect in order to be accepted, every ordinary task becomes heavier than it needs to be. A message must sound exactly right. A decision must carry no risk. A conversation must be handled without awkwardness. Even rest can feel undeserved, because the mind keeps asking whether something more should be done. Underneath perfectionism, there is often a quiet fear. If I make a mistake, I will lose approval, respect, safety, or control. Another root is the need to control what cannot fully be controlled. The anxious mind wants certainty before it allows peace. It wants to know how the future will unfold, how people will respond, whether the plan will work, whether pain can be avoided. This desire is understandable. The nervous system relaxes when life feels predictable, but life is never completely predictable. Other people have their own moods, choices, wounds, and timing. Circumstances change. Outcomes depend on more than effort alone. When the mind refuses this uncertainty, it begins trying to solve life in advance. It overthinks, rehearses, checks, predicts, and returns again and again to the same imagined danger. Past experiences can also teach the mind to expect threat where there may only be discomfort. A person who was criticized harshly may become anxious before being seen. A person who grew up around unpredictable emotions may become alert to every small change in someone's tone. A person who was rejected, embarrassed, or abandoned may feel danger whenever closeness becomes uncertain. The body remembers patterns long after the mind says, "That was in the past." And sometimes anxiety is the past, knocking on the present, asking whether the same pain is about to happen again. There are also quieter roots that do not always look emotional at first. Lack of sleep, too much caffeine, too much stimulation, too little movement, constant comparison, social pressure, a life built around expectations that do not match the person living it. Anxiety often grows when the whole system is overloaded. The mind may call it weakness, but sometimes it is simply exhaustion wearing the mask of fear. This is why the Stoic path asks for honesty, not self-attack. The question is not, "Why am I so anxious?" as if anxiety were a personal failure. A better question is, what is this anxiety connected to? Is it pointing to a boundary that has been ignored? A belief that every mistake will cost too much? A pressure to become someone you do not really want to be? A part of life where you are trying to control more than any human being can control? When the root is seen, anxiety becomes less mysterious. It may still be uncomfortable, but it is no longer just noise. It becomes information, and information can be worked with. The restless mind begins to calm, not only when the thought is challenged, but when the deeper condition feeding that thought is finally understood. Calm the body before you argue with the mind. A racing mind often begins with a body that does not feel safe. The thoughts may be the loudest part, so they receive most of the attention. They repeat, predict, warn, and demand answers. But underneath the thinking, the nervous system may already be activated. The breath becomes shallow. The chest tightens. The shoulders rise. The jaw locks. The stomach turns. The body starts preparing for danger, and then the mind tries to explain why danger must be near. This is why reasoning with anxiety too early can feel impossible. A person may tell themselves, "Nothing bad is happening," but the body is still sending a different message. The heart is beating quickly. The muscles are tense. The breathing is uneven. And because the body feels alarmed, the mind assumes there must be a reason. The feeling becomes evidence. The sensation becomes proof. Fear speaks through the body before logic has time to answer. So sometimes the first step is not to think better, but to signal safety physically. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough to lower the intensity. A longer exhale can tell the body that there is no immediate danger. Feeling the feet on the ground can remind the mind that it is here, not inside the imagined future. Relaxing the jaw, lowering the shoulders, unclenching the hands, or placing one hand on the chest can begin to interrupt the posture of threat. These are simple actions, but they speak in a language the nervous system understands. Breathing matters because it is one of the few bridges between the automatic body and conscious choice. It happens without effort, yet it can also be guided. When anxiety rises, breathing often moves higher into the chest and becomes faster than the moment requires. By slowing the breath, especially by extending the exhale, the body begins to receive a different message. Not everything is perfect, but right now, We are not in immediate danger. That message may be small, but small signals repeated with patience can begin to change the state of the whole system. The body also needs more ordinary forms of care than the anxious mind likes to admit. Sleep changes the way thoughts feel. Caffeine can make fear seem more urgent than it is. Long hours without movement can leave stress trapped as restlessness. Poor posture can deepen the sense of collapse. Even hunger, dehydration, and too much screen stimulation can make the mind more vulnerable to threat. Anxiety is not always a purely mental event. Sometimes it is the language of a body that has been pushed too far, stimulated too much, or given too little recovery. This does not mean anxiety is fake. It means the mind and body are deeply connected. A Stoic approach does not ignore the body as if wisdom lives only in thought. Self-command includes caring for the physical conditions that make clear judgment possible. It is difficult to think with balance when the body is exhausted. It is difficult to respond with patience when the nervous system is overloaded. It is difficult to see reality clearly when every sensation is being interpreted through alarm. Calming the body first gives the mind a better chance to be reasonable. Once the breath slows, once the muscles soften, once the body feels even slightly more grounded, the anxious thought loses some of its authority. It may still be there, but it is easier to examine. The mind can begin to ask whether the danger is real, whether the thought is a prediction, whether the present moment is safer than the imagination is claiming. Calm begins not as a perfect mental state, but as a physical return to the present. And from that return, reason can finally enter the room. Return to the present before the mind creates a disaster. Anxiety has a way of pulling the mind out of the only moment it can actually live in. The body may be here, in this room, in this day, surrounded by ordinary things, but the mind is somewhere else. It is in tomorrow's conversation, next week's problem, last year's mistake, or a future scene that has not happened but already feels real. This is one of anxiety's strongest movements. It makes the mind travel through time, and then asks the body to suffer as if the imagined moment has already arrived. The future is where anxiety often builds its most convincing stories. It takes uncertainty and fills it with threat. A meeting becomes humiliation before anyone has spoken. A health sensation becomes catastrophe before anything has been checked. A delayed reply becomes rejection before the other person has explained themselves. The anxious mind does not simply wonder what might happen. It begins rehearsing the worst version of what might happen, and with enough repetition, the rehearsal begins to feel like preparation. But sometimes what looks like preparation is only fear practicing itself. The past can pull with the same force. A memory returns, and suddenly the present is colored by something that already happened. A previous embarrassment makes today's opportunity feel dangerous. An old betrayal makes current silence feel suspicious. A painful failure makes a new beginning feel unsafe. The mind says it is being realistic, but often it is using old pain as a map for a different moment. And when the past becomes the map, the present is no longer seen clearly. This is why returning to the present is not a spiritual luxury, it is psychological survival. The present is where the facts are. The present is where the breath is. The present is where the body can be felt, where the floor can be touched, where the light in the room can be noticed, where the next small action can be chosen. Anxiety becomes overwhelming when the mind tries to live in a future it cannot control or a past it cannot repair. Presence brings attention back to the part of life that is still available. Grounding works because it gives the mind something real to hold, not an abstract argument, not a forced positive thought, but direct contact with the moment. The breath moving in and out, the feet pressing against the ground, the weight of the body in the chair, the sound in the room, the temperature of the air, the shape of an object nearby. These details may seem too simple for a mind that wants a dramatic solution, but they do something important. They interrupt mental time travel. They remind the nervous system that imagination is not the same as immediate danger. Naming thoughts can also help create space. Instead of saying, "This will go wrong," the mind can notice, "I am having a thought that this might go wrong." Instead of saying, "I cannot handle this," it can notice, "My mind is predicting that I will not cope." This small shift changes the relationship. The thought is still present, but it is no longer pretending to be reality itself. It becomes something being observed, not something automatically believed. The Stoic mind returns again and again to what is here, because what is here is the only place where action can happen. We cannot respond to an imagined disaster with wisdom while still treating it as certain. We cannot repair the past by replaying it endlessly, but we can return to this breath, this room, this moment, this next honest step. And sometimes calm begins there, not by solving the whole future, but by realizing that the future is not yet asking to be lived. Only this moment is. Stop treating every anxious thought as truth. One of anxiety's most convincing tricks is that it speaks with certainty. It rarely says, "This might happen, but I am not sure." It says, "This will happen." It rarely says, "This person may be busy." It says, "They are ignoring you." It rarely says, "This situation is uncertain." It says, "You are not safe." The anxious mind often turns predictions into conclusions, and because those conclusions arrive with emotional intensity, they can feel like truth. But a thought is not a fact. A thought is an event in the mind. It may be useful, or it may be distorted. It may be based on evidence, or it may be based on fear. It may be a wise warning, or it may be an old pattern repeating itself with confidence. The problem is not that anxious thoughts appear. The problem begins when every anxious thought is treated as if it deserves immediate belief. This is how catastrophizing works. The mind begins with one uncertain detail and then builds a whole disaster from it. A small mistake becomes the end of your reputation. A strange feeling in the body becomes something terrible. A difficult conversation becomes proof that everything will fall apart. The mind jumps from possibility to catastrophe so quickly that the middle steps disappear. It feels like logic, but often it is fear moving too fast. Another common distortion is mind reading. Anxiety tries to guess what other people think, feel, or intend, and then reacts as if the guess has already been confirmed. Someone seems distant, and the mind says they are disappointed in you. Someone replies briefly, and the mind says they are angry. Someone does not notice your effort, and the mind says you do not matter. These interpretations may be possible, but possible does not mean proven. Anxiety often forgets the difference. The Stoic approach is to slow the judgment down. Not every impression deserves agreement. Epictetus taught that when an impression appears, the mind does not have to accept it immediately. It can pause and examine it. In modern terms, this means asking whether the thought is supported by facts, whether there are other explanations, whether fear is exaggerating the meaning, and whether believing the thought is helping you respond wisely. This is not about arguing with yourself harshly. It is not useful to attack every anxious thought with frustration. That only creates more tension. A calmer approach is to treat the thought like a claim that needs evidence. The mind says, "This will go badly." A steadier part of you can ask, "What do I actually know right now?" The mind says, "I cannot handle this." A more balanced response might be, "This is uncomfortable, but I have handled difficult moments before." The mind says, "They will judge me." And perhaps the answer is, maybe they will, maybe they will not, but I do not need to live under a verdict that has not arrived. Journaling can help because anxious thoughts often become less powerful when they are taken out of the mind and placed on paper. Inside the head, a thought can feel enormous. Written down, it becomes more visible, more specific, and easier to question. The page creates distance. It allows the mind to see the difference between the fear, the evidence, and the possible response. Realistic thinking is not the same as positive thinking. It does not say, "Everything will be fine," because sometimes life is difficult and outcomes are uncertain. Realistic thinking says, "Let me see clearly." It makes room for risk without turning risk into doom. It makes room for discomfort without turning discomfort into danger. It makes room for uncertainty without allowing uncertainty to become a sentence. The anxious mind becomes quieter when it learns that thoughts can be noticed without being obeyed. A fearful prediction may appear, but it does not have to become the ruler of the next hour. A negative interpretation may arise, but it does not have to become identity. Between the thought and belief, there is a small space where wisdom can enter, and the more often that space is practiced, the less anxiety is able to disguise every fear as truth. Detach from outcomes without giving up control of yourself. Anxiety becomes stronger when the mind believes peace depends on life unfolding exactly as planned. The result must happen in a certain way. The person must respond with a certain tone. The future must become clear before the body is allowed to relax. The problem must be solved immediately. The risk must disappear. The uncertainty must close. And until that happens, the mind keeps working, checking, rehearsing, predicting, trying to force reality into a shape that feels safe. But life does not fully obey the mind's demand for certainty. We can prepare, speak honestly, act wisely, make better choices, and still not control every outcome. Other people have their own reactions. Timing is not always in our hands. Circumstances can shift without warning. Even when we do everything with care, the result may still remain uncertain. This is one of the hardest truths for an anxious mind to accept, because anxiety often believes that if it worries enough, it is somehow staying in control. Worry can feel like responsibility, but often it is only attachment wearing a serious face. The mind says, "I am thinking about this because it matters," and sometimes that is true. But after a certain point, thinking stops being useful and becomes a loop. The same fear repeats. The same scenario returns. The same imaginary conversation plays again. Nothing new is learned, nothing practical is done, but the body remains tense, as if worry itself were holding the world together. Stoic detachment offers a different kind of strength. It does not mean giving up. It does not mean becoming passive, careless, or emotionally numb. It means separating what belongs to your effort from what belongs to the outcome. Your effort belongs to you. Your honesty belongs to you. Your preparation, discipline, patience, courage, and response belong to you. But the final result is often shared with forces beyond your command. To confuse these two is to suffer twice, once from the challenge itself, and again from trying to control what was never fully yours. There is a difference between preference and attachment. A preference says, "I would like this to happen." Attachment says, I cannot be okay unless this happens. A preference allows effort. Attachment creates panic. A preference can move with reality. Attachment fights reality until exhaustion takes over. The anxious mind often turns preferences into conditions for survival. It does not simply want the conversation to go well. It believes it cannot tolerate the conversation going badly. It does not simply want success. It believes failure would destroy its sense of self. This is where anxiety begins to tighten around life. Detaching from outcomes means returning power to the place where power actually exists. It means asking, what is mine to do here? Maybe the answer is to prepare well. Maybe it is to send the message and stop rereading it. Maybe it is to have the conversation without trying to control the other person's reaction. Maybe it is to take the next step, then let the next step reveal itself. This kind of surrender is not weakness. It is the end of wasting energy on the impossible. Non-resistance does not mean liking everything that happens. Some outcomes hurt. Some disappointments are real. Some losses need time. But resistance says, this should not be happening over and over, while reality continues to happen. Acceptance says, this is happening. Now what kind of person will I be inside it? That question brings the mind back from helplessness into agency. Peace grows when you stop asking life to become perfectly predictable before you allow yourself to breathe. You can care about the result and still not belong to it. You can work towards something and still remain whole if it changes. You can hope, prepare, and act, while remembering that your deepest control is not over the outcome, but over the self that meets it. Build inner safety, instead of waiting for life to feel safe. Anxiety often tells the mind that calm will come later, after everything outside becomes secure, after the problem is solved, after the answer is clear, after the person responds, after the money is stable, after the body feels normal, after the future becomes predictable. The anxious mind keeps placing peace on the other side of certainty, and because certainty rarely arrives completely, peace keeps being postponed. But real calm cannot depend only on life feeling safe. Life changes too often for that. People are inconsistent. Plans are fragile. The body has strange sensations. The future never gives all its information in advance. If inner peace depends on perfect external safety, then the mind will remain at the mercy of every shift around it. This does not mean external safety is unimportant. A stable environment, healthy relationships, rest, and support all matter. But there is a deeper kind of safety that has to be built inside. The sense that even when life becomes uncertain, you can remain with yourself and respond. Inner safety begins with self-trust, not the belief that you will always know exactly what to do, but the belief that you can meet difficulty without abandoning yourself. You can feel fear and still breathe. You can feel uncertainty and still take one clear step. You can make a mistake and still repair it. You can be disappointed and still continue. The anxious mind often says, I need to know nothing bad will happen. Inner safety says, I may not know what will happen, but I can trust myself to face what comes with more steadiness than before. This is also where self-compassion becomes practical, not sentimental. Many anxious people speak to themselves in a way that would make anyone feel unsafe. They criticize every reaction, shame every fear, and treat every moment of struggle as evidence of weakness. But a mind that is constantly attacked from within cannot relax. It remains guarded because even its own inner voice feels threatening. Self-compassion doesn't mean excusing everything or avoiding responsibility. It means becoming a safer person to yourself. It means saying, "This is hard, but I do not have to hate myself for finding it hard." Boundaries are another part of inner safety. Anxiety often grows in lives where the self is too exposed to demands, conflict, pressure, and emotional noise. If every person has access to your attention, every problem becomes urgent, and every mood around you enters your nervous system, then calm becomes almost impossible. Boundaries tell the mind there is a place where we are allowed to be protected. Saying no, taking space, limiting certain conversations, and choosing who receives your emotional energy are not acts of coldness. They are ways of creating an inner environment where the nervous system can stop living as if it must answer everything. Supportive relationships matter too. The mind becomes calmer around people who do not make every feeling dangerous. A steady friend, a patient listener, a kind presence, even one honest conversation can remind the nervous system that it does not have to carry everything alone. Stoicism is sometimes misunderstood as self-reliance without tenderness, but the Stoics were not against human connection. They simply warned against making our peace completely dependent on what we cannot control. A balanced life allows support without turning support into dependency. Purpose also builds safety. When life has some direction, anxiety does not disappear, but it has less empty space to occupy. A person who is connected to something meaningful can return to that meaning when fear becomes loud. Purpose gives the mind a reason to endure uncertainty without being consumed by it. It says, "Even if I am afraid, there is still something worth moving toward." Inner safety is built slowly. It comes from repeated moments of not abandoning yourself, repeated moments of breathing through discomfort, repeated moments of choosing a kinder inner voice, a clearer boundary, a more honest action, a steadier relationship with uncertainty. And over time, the mind begins to learn something anxiety once made difficult to believe. Safety is not only something the world gives you, it is also something you can become for yourself. Regulate your emotions without suppressing them. Anxiety becomes more difficult when the mind believes there are only two options: either control the feeling completely or be controlled by it. Many people move between these two extremes. They try to push anxiety down, hide it, distract themselves from it, or pretend they are fine. Then, when the feeling grows too strong, it takes over all at once. The body floods, the thoughts race, the reaction becomes bigger than the moment. And afterward, there is often shame. The person may think, "I should have been stronger." But emotional strength is not the ability to feel nothing. It is the ability to feel something fully enough to understand it, without allowing it to drive every decision. Suppressing anxiety can look like discipline from the outside, but inside it often creates more pressure. The emotion does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It may move into the body as tension, into the mind as irritability, into sleep as restlessness, or into relationships as distance. What is not allowed to be felt directly often finds another way to speak. This is why calm cannot be built only by pushing feelings away. A quiet mind is not a mind where emotion has been buried. It is a mind where emotion has been given enough space to rise, be recognized, and move without becoming the ruler. Regulation begins with naming what is happening, not in a dramatic way, but with simple accuracy. This is anxiety. This is fear. This is pressure. This is my body entering alarm. Naming the emotion creates distance from it. The feeling is still there, but now there is also awareness. The whole self is no longer fused with the emotion. There is anxiety, and there is the person noticing anxiety. That small separation is one of the beginnings of freedom. The body also needs help staying inside what psychologists sometimes call the window of tolerance, the zone where emotion is present, but not so overwhelming that clear thought disappears. When anxiety pushes the body too high, grounding can bring the system down. A slower breath, a hand on the chest, cold water on the face, a walk outside, feeling the weight of the feet, looking around the room and naming what is actually here. These actions may seem small, but they remind the nervous system that the present moment is survivable. Self-soothing is not weakness. It is a skill. A person who can soothe themselves is less dependent on the world becoming perfect before they can settle. This might mean speaking inwardly with steadiness instead of criticism. It might mean reducing stimulation, stepping away from a tense conversation, resting before exhaustion becomes panic, or choosing one simple action instead of trying to solve the whole future at once. Emotional regulation is often very ordinary. It is the art of lowering the intensity enough that wisdom can return. There is also a time for opposite action. Anxiety often wants avoidance. It says, leave, delay, hide, do not try, do not speak, do not risk discomfort. Sometimes stepping back is wise, especially when the body is overwhelmed. But when avoidance becomes the main pattern, anxiety grows stronger because the mind learns that escape is the only path to safety. Opposite action means taking a small step toward what matters, even while anxiety is present. Sending the message, beginning the task for 5 minutes, entering the room, telling the truth carefully, not to prove toughness, but to teach the nervous system that fear can be present without being obeyed. This is close to the Stoic idea of self-command, not domination over emotion, but leadership within emotion. The feeling is allowed to exist, it is heard, it is respected as part of the human system, but it doesn't automatically receive the authority to decide who you become in the next moment. You can feel anxious and still act with patience. You can feel fear and still speak with honesty. You can feel pressure and still choose the next reasonable step. To regulate emotion is to become less afraid of your own inner weather. Some days will be heavy. Some moments will rise quickly. Some fears will return even after you thought you had outgrown them. But each time you feel without suppressing, ground without panicking, and respond without surrendering your judgment, the mind learns a deeper safety. It learns that emotion can move through you without taking you away from yourself. Transform fear into wisdom and courage. Fear becomes less overwhelming when it is no longer treated as a command. Most of the time, fear arrives with urgency. It says, stop, hide, delay, protect yourself, avoid the thing that might hurt. And sometimes fear is useful. It can keep a person from real danger. It can point toward a boundary that needs attention. It can reveal that something matters enough to make the body alert. But fear becomes limiting when every warning is obeyed without examination. A life guided only by fear slowly becomes smaller, not because the person lacks ability, but because the mind has learned to confuse discomfort with danger. A more useful question is not, how do I remove fear, but what is this fear trying to protect? That question changes the relationship immediately. Fear of failure may be protecting the need to feel worthy. Fear of rejection may be protecting an old wound around belonging. Fear of being seen may be protecting the self from criticism or shame. Fear of uncertainty may be protecting the mind from the pain of not knowing. When fear is studied in this way, it becomes information. It shows where the self feels exposed, where confidence is still fragile, where past experience may still be shaping the present. This does not mean fear is always wise. Fear often exaggerates. It takes a small risk and makes it look like a collapse. It takes one possible negative outcome and treats it as destiny. It speaks in the language of protection, but sometimes what it protects is not your peace. Sometimes it protects the old identity, the familiar limitation, the version of life where nothing new is attempted, and therefore nothing new can threaten the self-image. This is why fear has to be respected, but not worshipped. Courage begins when the mind can listen to fear without letting fear make the final decision. Courage is not the absence of anxiety. It is the ability to move with anxiety present when the movement is meaningful. A person may still feel the fast heartbeat, the uncertainty, the pull toward avoidance. But instead of treating those sensations as a stop sign, they begin to treat them as evidence that they are near the edge of growth. Not every edge should be crossed at once. Some require patience, preparation, and support. But avoiding every edge keeps the nervous system convinced that fear is always right. Gradual exposure is one of the most practical ways fear becomes wisdom. The mind does not usually become brave through one dramatic leap. It learns through repeated contact with manageable discomfort. A person afraid of speaking may begin with one honest sentence. A person afraid of conflict may begin by setting one small boundary. A person afraid of failure may begin by allowing one imperfect attempt to exist without turning it into identity. Each step teaches the nervous system that discomfort can be survived, and slowly the fear loses some of its authority. The Stoic view of courage is grounded in reality. It does not ask a person to chase danger for the sake of feeling strong. It asks a person to stop allowing fear to decide what is honorable, necessary, or true. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that the obstacle in front of him could become material for practice. In the same way, fear can become material for self-knowledge. It can reveal what you value. It can show where you need training. It can uncover beliefs that have been limiting the mind for years. When fear is transformed into wisdom, it no longer only says, "Something might hurt." It begins to ask, what kind of strength is being developed here? And when fear becomes connected to courage, it no longer has to shrink the life around it. It can become part of the path toward a calmer, more capable self. And if this idea helps you see fear with a little more clarity, write courage in the comments, not as a performance, but as a reminder that fear can be studied before it is obeyed. And stay with this episode, because next we will look at the inner dialogue that either feeds anxiety or guides the mind back toward calm. Master the inner dialogue that feeds anxiety. Anxiety is not shaped only by what happens to you. It is shaped by the voice that explains what happens. Two people can face the same uncertainty, the same delay, the same mistake, and live through completely different inner experiences because the dialogue inside them is different. One mind says, "This is uncomfortable, but I can take the next step." Another says, "This is the beginning of something terrible." The event may be similar, but the interpretation becomes the emotional world. The anxious inner voice often sounds urgent, absolute, and harsh. It does not usually speak with balance. It says, "You always do this. You cannot handle this. They will judge you. Something is wrong. You should have known better." And because this voice happens inside the mind, it can feel like truth. But not every inner voice is wisdom. Sometimes the voice inside is only fear using language. Sometimes it is an old critic repeating what was learned from parents, teachers, rejection, pressure, or painful experiences. Sometimes it is the nervous system trying to gain control by preparing for the worst. This inner critic often believes it is helping. It thinks that if it scares you enough, you will prepare better. If it shames you enough, you will avoid mistakes. If it predicts every danger, you will not be surprised by pain. But fear-based self-talk rarely creates peace. It may create temporary pressure, but it also teaches the body that the self is not a safe place to live. If every difficult moment is met with accusation, the mind begins to fear not only the outside world, but its own response to struggle. A calmer inner dialogue does not mean lying to yourself. It does not mean saying everything is fine when it is not. Realistic encouragement is different from forced positivity. Forced positivity says, nothing bad will happen. A wiser voice says, I do not know exactly what will happen, but I can meet this one step at a time. Forced positivity says, I am completely calm. A wiser voice says, anxiety is here, but it does not have to make the decision for me. The difference is important because the mind trusts language that respects reality. This is where the idea of an inner mentor becomes useful. Not a fantasy voice and not a perfect version of yourself, but a steadier way of speaking inwardly. An inner mentor does not attack the fear. It guides it. It asks better questions. What do I actually know right now? What is the next useful action? Is this thought a fact or a prediction? Am I trying to solve the whole future in one moment? What would I say to someone I loved if they were feeling this? These questions slow the spiral. They bring the mind out of panic and back toward judgment. Mental boundaries are part of this. Just as not every person deserves unlimited access to your energy, not every thought deserves unlimited space in your attention. Some thoughts can be noticed and released. Some can be written down and examined later. Some can be answered once, then left alone. The anxious mind often wants to reopen the same case again and again, hoping certainty will finally appear. But after a point, repetition is not reflection, it is rumination. A mental boundary says, I have considered this enough for now. I will return to what is real, what is useful, and what is mine to do. Over time, the inner dialogue becomes a kind of emotional environment. If the voice inside is cruel, the mind lives under threat, even when the outside world is calm. If the voice inside becomes steadier, more honest, and more humane, the nervous system begins to feel less alone. Anxiety may still speak, but it is no longer the only voice in the room. To master the inner dialogue that feeds anxiety is not to silence every fearful sentence. It is to stop letting fear write the whole conversation. The mind can learn a different tone. It can become firm without being harsh, realistic without being hopeless, encouraging without pretending. And when that voice is practiced often enough, it becomes easier to return to calm, not because life has become certain, but because the person inside the uncertainty has become more trustworthy. Rehearse calm before pressure arrives. Calm is harder to find when the mind only looks for it after panic has already taken over. By that point, the body is activated, the thoughts are moving quickly, and the nervous system is already preparing for threat. This is why calm has to be rehearsed before pressure arrives. Not because rehearsal makes life predictable, but because the mind and body become more likely to return to what they have practiced. Many people rehearse anxiety without realizing it. They imagine the conversation going badly. They picture themselves failing. They replay the worst possible outcome until the body begins to respond, as if the event is already happening. This kind of mental rehearsal trains the nervous system, but in the wrong direction. It teaches the body to enter the future through fear. And when the real moment comes, the mind says, "I knew this would feel dangerous," because it has already practiced danger many times. A different kind of rehearsal is possible. Before a difficult conversation, the mind can imagine entering it with a slower breath, a steadier tone, and a willingness to listen without losing itself. Before a stressful task, it can picture beginning imperfectly, staying with discomfort, and taking one step instead of trying to solve the whole thing at once. Before a moment that usually triggers anxiety, it can rehearse the body remaining grounded, the shoulders softening, the voice becoming slower, the attention returning to what is actually happening. This is not fantasy when it is connected to action. It is preparation. Visualization works best when it is embodied. The mind does not only need an image, the body needs to feel the state being practiced. A person can close their eyes for a moment and imagine a place that signals safety. A quiet room, a familiar path, the feeling of morning light, the sound of steady breathing, the sensation of sitting with both feet on the ground. The details do not need to be dramatic. They need to be believable enough for the nervous system to recognize them. Over time, this inner sanctuary becomes easier to return to, especially when anxiety begins to rise. There is also value in rehearsing difficulty realistically, not in the anxious way where the mind keeps replaying disaster, but in a grounded way. What if the conversation is uncomfortable? What if the answer is not what you hoped for? What if your voice shakes? What if the first attempt is imperfect? The point is not to scare yourself. The point is to show the mind that even an imperfect outcome can be lived through. This kind of rehearsal builds confidence because it does not depend on everything going perfectly. It teaches the nervous system that discomfort is survivable. The Stoic practice of premeditation has a similar spirit. The Stoics sometimes imagined obstacles before they arrived, not to become pessimistic, but to reduce shock. If difficulty was possible, they wanted the mind to meet it with some preparation rather than surprise. But this preparation was never meant to become obsessive worry. The purpose was steadiness, to say, "This may happen, and if it does, I will still have a response available to me." Rehearsing calm also shapes identity. The anxious mind often carries an image of the self as someone who collapses, freezes, panics, or cannot cope. Calm rehearsal introduces another image, someone who may feel fear, but can still return to breath. Someone who may feel pressure, but can still choose the next action. Someone who may not control the outcome, but can remain present enough to meet it. The more this identity is practiced, the less foreign it feels under stress. Calm does not usually appear by accident in difficult moments. It is built in ordinary moments, when nothing urgent is happening, through repeated contact with the state we want to remember later. A few breaths before the day begins. A short visualization before a hard conversation. A mental rehearsal of responding with patience before entering a stressful place. These practices may seem small, but they give the nervous system a path back when pressure arrives. And sometimes the difference between panic and steadiness is not that fear disappeared, but that calm had been practiced enough to be found again. Build resilience until calm becomes your baseline. A quiet mind is not built in one perfect moment. It is built through many small returns. Returning to the breath after the mind runs ahead. Returning to the body after thought becomes too fast. Returning to reality after fear has created a story. Returning to self-trust after uncertainty has made the future feel too large. Resilience is not the absence of anxiety. It is the growing ability to recover from it without losing yourself for as long as you once did. Many people imagine calm as a fixed state, something they either have or do not have. But calm is more like a capacity. It can be trained. It can weaken when life is neglected, and it can grow stronger when the mind and body are cared for consistently. A person becomes calmer not because nothing difficult happens, but because difficulty is no longer experienced as total collapse. The nervous system begins to learn that fear can rise and fall. Stress can come and go. Uncertainty can be uncomfortable without being unbearable. This is where repeated small acts matter more than dramatic breakthroughs. One honest boundary strengthens inner safety. One moment of realistic self-talk weakens the inner critic. One difficult task approached gently, instead of avoided, teaches the body that discomfort can be survived. One night of better sleep changes the emotional tone of the next morning. One conversation with a supportive person reminds the mind that it does not have to carry everything alone. None of these acts looks impressive from the outside, but together they begin to build a different baseline. A growth mindset, in this context, is not the shallow belief that every hardship is good. Some hardship is simply hard. Some experiences leave marks that need time, care, and support. But resilience asks whether pain must become permanent identity. It asks whether anxiety must be treated as proof of weakness, or whether it can become part of a larger training in self-understanding. The mind becomes more flexible when it stops seeing every setback as evidence that it is failing. It begins to see recovery itself as progress. Meaning also strengthens resilience. When life has some purpose, even a modest one, anxiety has less room to become the entire story. Purpose does not have to be grand. It may be caring for someone well, building a skill, healing a pattern, creating something honest, living with more integrity, or simply becoming a calmer person than you were yesterday. Meaning gives the mind a place to return when fear becomes loud. It says, "This discomfort is not the whole of my life. Physical health belongs here too, not as a perfect standard, but as support. Sleep, movement, food, sunlight, rest, and reduced overstimulation are not separate from emotional strength. They are part of the ground beneath it. A tired body makes the mind more vulnerable to threat. A cared-for body gives wisdom a better chance to be heard." Over time, calm becomes less like something you chase and more like something you recognize. Anxiety may still appear, but it enters a system that knows how to recover. Fear may still speak, but it no longer speaks to a mind that believes every word. Pressure may still come, but the self has practiced returning often enough to remember the way back. This is resilience, not a life without storms, but an inner structure that does not fall apart every time the weather changes. To quiet an anxious mind is not to win a war against yourself. It is to stop turning your own inner life into a battlefield. Anxiety may arrive with force, but it does not have to become the final authority. It can be understood as a signal, traced back to its roots, softened through the body, brought back into the present, questioned with honesty, and held with enough wisdom that it no longer controls every decision. The deeper lesson is that calm is not found by making life perfectly safe. Life may never offer that kind of certainty. There will always be unanswered messages, unfinished problems, uncertain futures, difficult conversations, strange sensations, unexpected changes, and moments where the mind wants to run ahead and prepare for pain. But peace becomes more possible when the mind no longer demands full control before it allows itself to breathe. Stoic psychology gives us a practical kind of hope. Not the hope that nothing will go wrong, but the hope that even when something feels uncertain, the self can remain present. You can pause before believing every thought. You can calm the body before arguing with fear. You can separate facts from predictions. You can care about outcomes without being owned by them. You can build inner safety instead of waiting for the world to remove every risk. You can feel anxiety without letting it decide who you become. This does not happen all at once. The anxious mind has often practiced fear for years. It has rehearsed danger, scanned for rejection, imagined collapse, and mistaken urgency for truth. So it needs repetition to learn another way. Not harsh repetition, patient repetition, the kind that says, I wandered into fear again, and now I return. I believed the thought for a moment, and now I examine it. I felt the body tighten, and now I breathe. I reached for certainty, and now I come back to what is mine to do. There is something deeply human about this work. It does not make you less sensitive. It does not make you cold. It does not remove emotion from life. If anything, it allows you to live with more honesty, because you're no longer spending all your energy running from what you feel. Anxiety becomes something you can meet, study, soothe, and learn from. It becomes part of the mind's language, but not the whole conversation. And maybe the quietest form of healing is this. One day, fear still appears, but you do not follow it as far. The thought still comes, but you do not build a home inside it. The body still reacts, but you know how to help it return. The future is still uncertain, but uncertainty no longer feels like proof that you are unsafe. You are still human, still learning, still unfinished. But inside that unfinished life, calm begins to feel less like a distant place and more like a way of coming back to yourself.